Hey everyone, thanks for joining. My name's John. This is Audrey.
Hello.
Audrey's a super cool developer hanging out over there in Arkansas right now. Please, okay, correct me if I'm
Yep.
wrong on that. That would be awful if I got that wrong right now. And today we
Shame.
want to talk about package managers. So on the left in this Wicked.js Paint agenda, you can see package managers compared. Got 5 big bullets, and we're just going to go sequentially through them. So, starting with the basics, what is a package manager and why? So, basically, a package manager is a thing that manages packages. Packages of code is usually what we're talking about. There's a bunch of reasons you would want to use one. One is to help you set up your computer. So, brew on Mac, chocolatey on Windows, yum on Linux. These will help you install basic programs. And then also when it comes to software development, libraries, installing libraries for development purposes, and then also shipping your application, you can build your own package. So here's what ChatGPT says. As an expert software engineer, I can tell you that a package manager is a collection of software tools that automates the process of installing, upgrading, configuring, and removing computer programs. List of 5, Audrey, here we go.
Okay.
There are several reasons developers and system administrators use package managers. One is simplicity. It automates installing, upgrading, and downgrading software. Right. So for me, this really speaks to the importance of developer experience, DevX. Or if you're at a company and you're not a developer, if you're just like in IT, employee experience, employee satisfaction. Consistency, totally agree. I don't just want to make sure you, Audrey, or me, John, has a pleasant experience setting up my computer. I want all the computers to be set up the same way, which is good for security, maintainability. As an IT department, I know how to fix all the computers because they're set up the same way, right?
Makes sense.
Dependency management. This is going to be a huge one. And this is one of the ways that we can actually tell what is a good package manager versus a lower quality package manager is the ability to correctly and securely resolve dependencies. So saying, hey, I'm building this website and I depend on React and I depend on Prettier and all of these packages. Then we get into situations where I might want to deploy it and have users use it. I also might want to send it to my peer developer so that we can like both work on it. And I don't know about you, Audrey, but if we're working on the same project, I want to make sure we're like installing the same packages, right?
100%.
I have one last thing to mention that I just noticed. My stupid face is on the screen in 2 places. So, have you ever had an issue like this where you install a different version of a library? It could even be the same library, but it's just a different version, and you're getting some bug, and like I can't reproduce it.
Yes, and there was also a situation where it was a preventative measure. Is it was discovered that there weren't versions pinned of everything, and so it was just kind of open for interpretation and willy nilly. So nothing happened because we pinned the dependencies and made sure they were all good. But it was, kind of a clue into me of, okay, I think this is important, and it makes sense as to why it's important.
I love that. I'm going to make a note here. We'll do a chain of thought prompt with ChatGPT. So chain of thought prompting just means I ask it a question and then I ask it a follow-up question. We do this with humans all the time. If I ask you too many questions at the same time, it's hard to give clear and ordered answers. If I ask you one thing and then ask a follow-up question, that's called a chain of thought. And Audrey just called out that pinning dependencies improves the ability of developers to troubleshoot issues and prevent them. I'm going to add, it's also great for security. And now I'm going to ask ChatGPT, what are some similar practices that are important when we think about using a package manager? So
That's a great question.
pinning dependencies is a key feature of package managers. And Audrey, to your point, in this list of 5, number 3 was dependency management, and number 4 is version control. So both of these are actually related to pinning versions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then number 5 is security. So when we get into some of the differences, Yarn versus NPM, the origin story for why Yarn got popular is there were security problems with NPM.
I think I read about that.
Yeah.
I think I read like a little like blog of, because I think I Googled why use Yarn, because I'm using it on a project currently.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. That's just what we use. So, but I
This
want to
is
know
a
why.
really this is a really important point. In many cases, when the answer is it doesn't matter which you pick, but you don't want to mix them. So you can use them just as much as you use Yarn today, but don't mix them. If you have a package lock, don't use Yarn. And if you have a Yarn lock, don't use NPM. Simple rule.
Makes sense.
Examples of package managers include apt. So I talked about Yum, but apt is another one for Linux. NPM for JavaScript, pip for Python, Maven for Java. There's also Gradle is a really good one for Java. Cool. So that's just a list of some of these tools that are what we're talking about. And you might also, depending on the company that you're working at, you might have an enterprise package manager. So Artifactory from JFrog is really common. This will protect your company by protecting you against a malicious package attack. The way a malicious package attack works is Audrey published this cool new library, and she's like a good person. And then like I'm like a bad person, and I literally take her computer, put a virus in her library, and publish a new version. So that anyone who's using her library, if they upgrade, they get infected with my virus. That's a malicious package attack. Having a commercial package manager like Artifactory protects you because basically you can make sure that people inside your company can only install certain versions. So it's kind of similar to that version pinning idea, but it's an additional layer of security. What are some similar practices that we think are important? Semantic versioning. This is a great one. Symver. We have versions, right? We want to upgrade, we want to downgrade. How do I know that one version is higher or lower than another? Well, you can count like version 1, version 2, version 3. That's a versioning strategy. So semantic versioning allows you to say, hey, like this one is higher than that one, but it tells you even more because there's conventions that we have around when to bump which numbers. So semantic versioning will have 3 numbers. It'll be, for example, 1.0.2. And we say there's the major version, the minor version, and the patch version. You only change the major version if there is a breaking change. Or in the case of like Angular 1 to Angular 2, that was like a famous like massively breaking change where it's like, we don't even do things that resemble what we used to do.
Yeah, scrap it.
Yeah. So that would be a major bump. A minor bump includes often new features and sometimes soft deprecations, but you typically shouldn't just see an API vanish. So you shouldn't have a major destruction and a minor increase. And then patch versions are typically just for security improvements. So basically no feature change at all, no deprecations, no additions, just like bug fixes pretty much is what patch is intended for. So yes, virtual environments are a best practice. This is really prevalent in the Python ecosystem. When we talk about virtual environments literal, using the venv library, but the abstract pattern of having isolated dependencies within a container is super common. We also do this with Docker and with open container specifications like Kubernetes containers. Just the idea of, and then back in the day we had these things called virtual machines that were super slow, but it's the same idea, is if we are going to wreck a computer, let's not make it my computer. It's like, if we're going to fry something, let's have it be some other system container. regular audits, right? So a good package manager like NPM these days will have a built-in audit feature. So with NPM, you can use NPM audit, and you can use a tool like Snyk, SNYK, that will automatically look in your dependency files, and your dependency file will change based on your language and based on your software. And these audit tools know like all the different files in the different languages, and they can just check like, is this version on the known vulnerability list? So that's what Snyk does. Remove unused dependencies. You might be a software engineer if you love deleting unused dependencies.
Yes!
What would be the
We have
equivalent?
fun with that at work. We will type in Slack, found another package I can remove. It's like an exciting hooray thing.
There's the Bobby Flay. You know Bobby Flay?
Mm-hmm.
One thing he always says is like, if you can't eat it, get it off my plate.
I love that.
So
That's
maybe,
good.
so if you're like in food service and that's your vibe, you might have a future in programming. Oh, it says use log files. Great. It's just stealing all my thunder. And use private repositories or proxies. So when I talked about Artifactory, that is a proxy service. A private repository is basically, you can, like GitHub, you can have a repository that everyone in the world can look at it. That's called a public repository. Or you can go over the settings tab and hit private. And now like only you can see the code. That's called a private repository. Yarn versus NPM. So here we're in JavaScript world. Today in 2023, I think you can initialize a project with either of these and it's totally fine.
Okay.
Whichever you pick, stick with it. So don't mix them, that will cause issues. So here we have Blitz.js showing NPM and Yarn. So this is giving you the feel that NPM is pretty popular, right? And that's no coincidence. In case we didn't already mention it, NPM is built in to Node. When you install Node, you get NPM for free. And if you want to install Yarn, you typically install it through NPM. Here is some stuff it says that ChatGPT says about PNPM. It's another package manager for Node. Here's some reasons you might prefer it. One, it has efficient storage. It creates hard links or symlinks in Node modules. So you get a smaller Node modules. That's great. We love that.
That's nice to know.
It's performant because it's more efficient. It can install more quickly. We love that. It works with monorepos. That's good. It's compatible with the NPM registry, so it can use all of the same packages. I don't know if that's a reason to pick it though, because like,
Right.
that's true with the others too, right?
Yeah.
PNPM recursive to run commands in all packages at once. Cool. So I don't know offhand like a use case where I would want to do that, but yeah, maybe if you have a use case for recursively calling your packages, then that would be something to use. And then let's mention NVM, which is Node Version Manager. So Node itself, you might work in a company that has projects that were started at different points in time, and they might use different versions of Node. You might want to start a new project with the latest version of Node, but you don't want to uninstall the node that's for all the other projects. You want to be able to switch quickly between them. That's what NVM Node Version Manager will let you do. There's another tool called ASDF. It is sort of like a language agnostic NVM, so it can version Node, Python, Ruby, and more, all using this one tool. You can also do some stuff like this with Brew, which is the Mac OS package manager. You can even install Node with Brew, and you can install a bunch of this stuff with Brew. Brew is really great when you're first setting up your Mac. You can install a bunch of stuff that way.
It is very handy, yeah.
Chocolatey is the equivalent on Windows, except it's awful. It doesn't work well, in my experience anyway. And kudos to them if they fixed it in the past year, and I'm just unaware. So in principle, it is an operating system package manager for Windows, but in practice, my developer experience was greatly degraded. So let's get into the Python world. So pip is the one that's built in. Pip tools is built into Python. Poetry is nice because it allows you to immediately shell. So if I'm switching between a bunch of different Python projects, I can use poetry run and it will respect my local repository level settings. So you get a little bit of that NVM flavor where I can kind of effectively switch between different versions without reinstalling. And it keeps it isolated. So with pip and with ordinary Python, there's a built-in venv module, which lets you install a virtual environment. This is like the normal way to isolate your dependencies in Python. Poetry wraps this. So you literally, like when you use a Poetry virtual environment, it's literally the same venv. It's just like integrated to Poetry so that you can do Poetry shell if you want to. And I don't need to source, activate a venv, and then deactivate it and switch over. I can just do that in one line with Poetry.
That's really handy and useful to know, especially if, I don't know, I can see that for like legacy code use cases, if you're working on something that, you know, is still alive and you got to keep it going, but all your versions are way behind or something. So,
yeah.
Okay.
It's not a free lunch. There's some gotchas with Poetry. The main gotcha with Poetry is that if you want to build packages, it doesn't work with pip tools the same way pip does. So if you're using MyPyC to get some C compilation to have like super fast Python, Poetry is not going to be fun for you. If you're just using like ordinary Python code, it should work pretty well. And the lock file can actually resolve problems that pip tools will run into if you just do a pip install requirements. You might get a version incompatibility that, hey, you're requiring two different files and pip tools cannot find a set of libraries that satisfies all of them. Sometimes Poetry can get you around that. And the reverse is also true. Sometimes Poetry will fail to resolve and pip tools will successfully resolve.
Interesting.
Because the method of library dependency resolution is different. Conda is like big and slow and kind of icky in some ways, but it's cool in other ways. So you get a bunch of stuff out of the box when you install Conda. And if you want it, that's good. And if you don't want it, that's bad. One of the things that's interesting about Conda is that you can install like binaries and stuff that's like not Python. You can install that through the Conda package manager. And then Yum is kind of like brew or chocolatey for Linux, and there's also apt, so depending on the flavor of Linux, you might be working with either one of those. There's also npx, which is a feature of npm, and the equivalent would be yarn dlx in yarn. And this is an immediate invocation system. So you would want to use an immediate invocation system if you have a need to run a library one time, and that's pretty much it. So when would you want to run a library one time? Initializing a new project is like a really great use case. Cool, yeah, so installation, start a new project, and the top recommendation, npx create next app. Package management and Docker. What about Docker, Venv, and globals? You can use Venv inside of Docker if you want to. There's just like not a lot of reason to do it because Docker's already a Venv. So it's kind of bloating your Docker and it's creating some indirection. If you want to troubleshoot, if you ever shell into your Docker, you can't just see the site packages right there. You have to go into the Venv. Depending on how you install things, if you are the Docker root user or the Docker local user, you can get issues. So if you like install your site packages ahead of time in a Venv as root, and then you try to use them as a named user later on, you will have access and permission issues.
That makes sense. Okay, and that was my assumption with that, because just the way that Docker works, it makes sense. So it felt like, but I just wasn't sure. It felt like a Venv was like a duplication of something that's already happening out of the box with Docker, and why you're using Docker in the first place, part of why. Okay, and then I didn't even think about the permissions or compatibility issues between root and local users, and that also makes sense.
One of the ways that you can get away from some of that is to use flags when you're installing. So when you're installing on pip, it's really smart to use python-m pip install instead of just using pip install. Because a weird problem can happen where if you call the pip command line tool, it might be someone else's pip. And that's a really weird bug if you ever run into it. But the way you just avoid it is you specify which Python and you do -m pip, and there's only one pip for one Python. You can also use
Whoa.
Yep. And you can
Okay.
also use the user flag when you're installing in Docker. So
Okay.
that can get you away from some of those issues. One of the reasons you might want to have a Vim inside of Docker, even though you don't need to, and it's kind of like, why are you doing this? It's unnecessary. One of the reasons is just developer experience and making it easy. If I have a script that I run on my local machine and I just want to run that same literal script in Docker, that's one reason they might both like assume there's a Vim. So that happens sometimes. I would encourage you to try to not use Vim in Docker. But if it happens, like, that's fine. Don't freak out. And globals. You can use globals in Docker because Docker basically is its own virtual environment, so it's safe. And there's cases where you need to do that, but I would encourage you to try to avoid it and try to keep things local. Even though you can securely use globals in Docker, when I'm thinking in a 12-factor app paradigm, I would ideally like to do the same thing on my machine in staging and dev and prod and testing. I would ideally be running the same logic in all of those cases, which is going to let me catch bugs earlier, and it's going to let me reproduce issues that I see in various environments. So to accomplish that, if I'm using globals in Docker, I should be using globals on my machine. But we know that I should not be using globals on my machine. And so that's
Right.
that's one of the reasons that I would encourage you to avoid globals in Docker. It's not that there's like a problem from a Docker perspective, it's just for a consistency point of view.
Okay.
Cool. So summing up with the big lessons, lock your dependencies, use a lock file, prefer a package manager that has a lock file. Isolate your dependencies, don't use globals, don't install packages globally. Even with something like Black, you might be, so Black is
That
like
was actually the specific one I had a question on because
Yeah.
say it's your company's like SOP for your
Yeah.
engineering team is Black. Is it still better go ahead and install that locally per Docker environment versus just blasting it on your computer?
I encourage you to install the repository level Black as opposed to system level Black. It may be considered splitting hairs depending on your company. It might be a micro optimization. It might not make much of a difference. But this is going to enable you in your next project to upgrade, and you won't get stuck with old technology. The reason that some companies, this isn't a big value add to them, and they say just install it globally, it doesn't matter, is because they're always using the same version. Well, that's fine until you want to upgrade.
Right.
So keep it isolated. With your Black configuration, try to execute repository level configuration files and editor config there, or a PyProject TOML there. Same with Prettier in JavaScript world. Put your Prettier RC or your Prettier config, whichever version of configuration that you're using. By the way, editor config can work across languages, so that's interesting.
Oh, huh. Okay.
But try to use one that's specified at the repository level. This is going to keep it isolated. It's going to let you upgrade your next project more easily, and it's going to improve new user onboarding and new developer onboarding to your team. They will just have to clone the repository and everything works, as opposed to spending days to get their machine in a state that the repository expects the machine to pre-exist in, which is like a really goofy and difficult way to onboard a new developer.
Documentation is important, and having everything same is important.
Slay. Anything else?
I love it. I think that, every question I had was pretty much nailed. It was more of just you're working in these environments, you're doing it, you think you're doing the right thing, but you're not sure. There's convoluted information out there. No, I love it. It's removed the mysticism of package management, versioning. It's not this big scary thing. It's quite simple. Use the right tools in the right environment, and you'll be good to go.
Thank you so much for your time. I have one last thing to mention that I just noticed. My stupid face is on the screen in 2 places. So this is going to be a great video. Thank you so much for your time. Bye.